June 15, 1945. Camp Hearn, Texas, 1400 hours. 23 German women sat before a table that looked like American propaganda come to life. Golden fried chicken piled high on platters. Mashed potatoes swimming in butter so rich it formed yellow pools across white ceramic. Warm biscuits that released steam when broken open, their flaky layers perfect and impossible. Their hands trembled as they reached for the food. Their eyes filled with tears that spilled down cheeks, still gaunt from months of inadequate rations. And then they broke down completely, sobbing so hard they could barely draw breath, their shoulders shaking with the force of emotions they had suppressed for years. Not because they were being tortured, not because they were starving, but because they could not stop eating. These were enemy soldiers, women who had worn the gray uniform of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, women who had served a regime now revealed as monstrous beyond comprehension, women who had been warned during their final weeks of freedom that Americans would beat them, starve them, work them to death in the brutal Texas heat. Instead, 3 days after arriving at this prison camp in the middle of nowhere, they sat before the most beautiful meal they had seen in 5 years. A meal prepared with care and dignity by the very people they had been taught to fear most. A meal that would shatter everything they believed about enemies, about America, and about what human decency looked like when it was real instead of propaganda. What happened next would change 10 of these women forever. It would turn them from defeated soldiers into witnesses to a truth their country had tried to destroy, that mercy was stronger than hatred, that individuals could rise above the worst things their nations did, and that sometimes a single plate of fried chicken offered with respect could change the entire trajectory of a life. But to understand why enemy soldiers broke down over a Sunday meal, we need to go back 3 days earlier. Back to the moment 23 women stepped off a transport truck and into what they believed would be hell. Back to June 12, 1945, when everything they thought they knew about their captors was about to be proven wrong. June 12, 1945, noon. The temperature had already climbed past 107 degrees Fahrenheit. The military transport truck groaned to a stop, its brakes squealing in protest after the long journey from the processing center in New York. Metal doors swung open with a harsh clang that echoed across the empty Texas landscape. A wall of heat hit the women like a physical blow, sucking the moisture from their mouths, making their eyes sting with sudden dryness. Helena Brandt was 24 years old. She stepped down from the truck onto dust and gravel that shimmered in the merciless sun. Before her capture near the Belgian border during the war's chaotic final weeks, she had worked as a radio operator in Cologne. Intelligent, observant, trained to notice patterns and decode meaning from static-filled transmissions. Now she clutched a small canvas bag against her chest. Everything she owned in the world fit inside one change of clothes already worn thin, a photograph of her family standing in front of their Cologne apartment building, and a book of Rilke's poetry she had carried through 3 years of military service. The other women filed out behind her in rigid formation, their military training still reflexive even in defeat. Sophie Klein, 22 years old, youngest of the group. Before the war, she had been a clerk in Dresden, filing papers and typing correspondence for a textile company. Now she radiated nervous energy, her eyes darting constantly, trying to assess threats from every direction. She tried to stand taller than her small frame allowed, tried to project strength she did not feel. Margaret Schmidt, 26, emerged last. A medical assistant from Stuttgart, she had spent the war years treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals that retreated steadily westward as the Reich collapsed. Her face was stern, etched with premature lines from too many decisions made under impossible circumstances. She had become the unofficial leader of this group during their weeks of captivity, the one who reminded the younger women to show no weakness, to maintain dignity, to survive whatever came next. Camp Hearn stretched before them like something from a nightmare made real. Barbed wire fencing extended in every direction, catching the sunlight and throwing it back in sharp metallic glints. Guard towers rose at regular intervals, their shadows cutting across the compound in geometric precision. Armed American soldiers watched from every corner, their faces unreadable beneath helmet brims, their rifles held with casual familiarity that suggested they knew exactly how to use them. The women stood in their formation gray auxiliary uniforms, stained with dust from the long journey, faces carefully blank. They had been trained to reveal no emotion, no weakness, no vulnerability that could be exploited. They were prisoners now, and prisoners survived by becoming invisible, by drawing no attention, by giving their captors no reason to single them out for special treatment. But they had also been warned. During the final months of the war, as Allied forces closed in from east and west, whispered stories had spread through German military units like wildfire. Stories about what Americans did to their prisoners, how they beat them systematically, breaking bones and spirits with equal efficiency, how they deliberately starved them, watching them grow skeletal with cruel amusement, how they worked prisoners in brutal heat until they simply dropped dead, their bodies left where they fell, as warnings to others. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as ruthless savages, as people driven by base instincts and racial hatred, as soldiers who saw Germans not as fellow human beings, but as vermin to be exterminated. The propaganda had been specific, vivid, designed to terrify. It had shown photographs that may or may not have been real. It had quoted testimony that may or may not have been fabricated. But it had been consistent, relentless, impossible to entirely dismiss. Looking at the barbed wire and the armed guards and the towers that commanded every angle of the compound, Helena wondered how much of it was true. How much of the propaganda had been exaggeration designed to keep German soldiers fighting past any rational hope of victory, and how much had been accurate preparation for the hell they were about to experience. A woman emerged from the administration building, her boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. Captain Sarah Morrison was younger than Helena had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything at once. Her uniform was crisp despite the heat, a stark contrast to the dusty, wrinkled appearance of the new arrivals. Behind her walked two guards, their expressions uncertain in a way that did not match the propaganda's description of brutal conquerors. Corporal Thomas Walker was tall and lanky, with a slow southern way of speaking that stretched vowels into unfamiliar shapes. Private Michael Brennan looked barely old enough to shave his face, still carrying the soft lines of late adolescence. He fidgeted, constantly shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes sliding away whenever they accidentally met those of the prisoners. This was clearly his first time dealing with enemy combatants, and he seemed as uncomfortable with the situation as the women themselves. Captain Morrison stopped before them, her posture military perfect, but her tone neither friendly nor hostile, just professional, businesslike, as if she were processing paperwork rather than enemy soldiers who had until recently been trying to kill Americans. "Welcome to Camp Hearn," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "You will be housed in Barracks 7. You will follow camp regulations at all times. Roll call happens twice each day, morning and evening. Work assignments will be given tomorrow after your medical inspection. The medical inspection will occur in 1 hour. Any questions?" The German women stayed silent. They had been instructed during transport from New York, their orders delivered by a weary Wehrmacht officer, who was himself a prisoner. Do not speak unless directly addressed. Do not show emotion of any kind. Do not give your captors any reason to single you out for attention. Survive by being unremarkable. Survive by following orders. Just survive. Helena's hands tightened around her canvas bag. Her heart pounded against her ribs hard enough that she wondered if others could hear it. She watched Private Brennan shift his weight from foot to foot and again watched him glance at Corporal Walker as if seeking reassurance. Watched him look almost as uncomfortable as she felt. That was strange. Everything about this arrival was strange. The captain's professional tone delivered without mockery or threat. The guards who seemed uncertain rather than cruel, who looked like they were following a script nobody had fully written for them. The complete absence of shouting of violence, of the immediate brutality they had been promised, would begin the moment they arrived. Corporal Walker spoke quietly to Private Brennan, something about water distribution schedules. His tone was patient, almost gentle, not the voice of someone preparing to inflict suffering. Sophie stood next to Helena, so close their shoulders almost touched. She was 22, one of the youngest in the group, a former clerk from Dresden, who still tried to carry herself like someone older and stronger than she was. Her eyes darted around the compound, taking in every detail, searching for the danger that must be hiding just out of sight. Later, she would write in a journal entry that survived the decades. "We stood there waiting for the punishment to begin. We stood there for a very long time. It never came." Margaret Schmidt was the eldest among them at 26. She had served as a medical assistant in Stuttgart before her capture, treating soldiers who returned from the Eastern Front with wounds that ranged from treatable to hopeless. Now she watched the American Guards with careful suspicion, her medical training making her hyper-aware of body language, of the subtle signs that revealed true intentions beneath surface appearances. These men had weapons. These men had power. And yet they seemed almost awkward, like actors in a play where they had not quite memorized their lines. The women were led to their barracks through compound heat that pressed down like a physical weight. Simple wooden buildings arranged in neat rows, functional utilitarian designed for efficiency rather than comfort. They entered Barrack 7 and found rows of bunks with thin mattresses that were nonetheless actual mattresses, not the bare planks they had expected. Windows that actually opened to let in whatever breeze might exist in this furnace. A posted schedule on the wall that made Helena stop and stare in confusion. 3 meals per day, breakfast at 700, lunch at 1200, dinner at 1800, 3 meals per day for enemy prisoners. In Germany by 1945, civilians were surviving on roughly 1,500 calories per day if they were lucky. Many got far less. The concept of 3 full meals had disappeared, entirely replaced by whatever could be scraped together from increasingly barren supplies. Thin soup, hard bread, potatoes when available. The old and the young were dying of malnutrition in numbers that had become too common to shock anyone anymore. And here this schedule casually listed 3 meals per day. For prisoners, for enemies who had until recently been part of a military machine trying to destroy America. Helena stared at that schedule, trying to make sense of it, trying to reconcile it with everything she had been told about how Americans treated their captives. The cognitive dissonance was physically uncomfortable, like trying to hold 2 contradictory truths in her mind simultaneously. That evening, they filed into the dining hall for their first meal. The room was large and plain, with long tables and benches that could accommodate hundreds. They received beef stew, actual beef, visible in the thick liquid, not just the memory of meat that had characterized German rations for years. Real bread with a texture that suggested it had been baked recently, not the sawdust mixtures they had grown accustomed to. Vegetables that still had color and substance. Not a feast by any definition, but adequate, hot, edible. Food that seemed designed to nourish rather than merely to prevent immediate starvation. Sophie whispered to Helena in German, her voice barely audible. "It's not poisoned. Look at the guards. They're eating the same food we are." Margaret's warning came swift and sharp. "Don't trust appearance. This is psychological warfare. They feed us adequately now to weaken our resistance. Later comes the cruelty. Stay alert. Trust nothing." But Helena noticed something that troubled her more than cruelty would have. The portions were equal. Each woman received the same amount of stew, the same pieces of bread. No one was being singled out for less food as punishment or for more food as reward for cooperation. The American guards moved through the line, receiving their own meals from the same pots, eating at their own tables without ceremony or separation. It was just a meal, simple, fair, without the elaborate hierarchy of suffering she had been taught to expect. If you appreciate these forgotten stories from World War II that almost nobody knows about, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. It helps us bring more incredible true stories to light. And if you or someone in your family served during this time, maybe even encountered German POWs in Texas or elsewhere, I would love to hear your story in the comments below. These personal memories are how we keep this history alive for future generations. Now let me take you back to that scorching June day when 23 women were about to learn that everything they had been taught about Americans was a carefully constructed lie. The second day brought moments that accumulated like small cracks in a dam, each one insignificant by itself, together suggesting that something fundamental was wrong with the story they had been given about their captors. June 13th afternoon. The temperature climbed past 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The women were assigned to light outdoor work detail, sorting supplies in the sun. Not difficult labor, but the heat made everything harder. Several women began showing signs of heat exhaustion within the first hour. Pale skin growing paler, slight swaying when standing still. The dangerous glassiness in eyes that suggested the body's cooling system was beginning to fail. Helena watched as Private Michael Brennan appeared with the extra canteens of water. He did not announce his arrival, did not wait for gratitude or acknowledgement. simply set the canteens down near where the women were working and walked away quickly, his movements almost furtive, as if embarrassed by his own gesture of basic human decency. Such a small thing, a few canteens of water on a dangerously hot day. But Sophie whispered the question they were all thinking: why would he do that? Margaret cut her off before the speculation could spread. Regulations don't read meaning into following orders. They're keeping us functional for whatever they're planning. But all three women exchanged glances that suggested they were no longer entirely certain of that explanation. This small kindness did not fit the narrative of captors who saw their prisoners as subhuman creatures worthy only of suffering. That same afternoon, one of the women stumbled on the barracks steps. Anna Weber, 25 years old, who had worked in a government office in Munich before the war. Her foot caught on the edge of a wooden plank warped by Texas heat. She pitched forward, arms windmilling about to go down hard on unforgiving wood. Private Brennan reached out instinctively. His hand closed on her elbow, steadying her, preventing the fall. For perhaps 2 seconds, they stood like that American soldier and German prisoner, connected by his reflexive attempt to prevent her from being hurt. Then he caught himself, realized what he had done, stepped back awkwardly, and looked at the ground as if ashamed of his own kindness, as if helping an enemy prisoner was a weakness he needed to hide from his superiors. No punishment followed, no mockery, just awkwardness. Just a young man who had been trained to see enemies but whose fundamental decency kept interfering with the ideology he was supposed to embrace. Margaret gathered the younger women that evening after lights out. Her voice was low and urgent in the darkness of the barracks. Don't mistake exhaustion for kindness. Don't mistake youth for harmlessness. Their soldiers are still enemies. That fact hasn't changed just because the shooting stopped. But even as she spoke, Helena heard the uncertainty creeping into Margaret's voice. The slight hesitation that suggested even their stern leader was beginning to doubt the certainty of her warnings, because none of this matched what they had been told. None of it fit the propaganda that had been drilled into them during training, during deployment, during the desperate final months when Wehrmacht leadership had needed soldiers to keep fighting, despite the hopelessness of their situation. Morning of the third day, June 14th. Morning roll call under a sun already fierce at 0700 hours. Corporal Thomas Walker attempted to greet them in German. His pronunciation was catastrophically bad, his southern accent mangling the already foreign sounds into something almost unrecognizable. Go 10 more, Jen, he said, stretching the vowels into shapes no German speaker had ever intended. Several women responded automatically before catching themselves. Guten Morgen, they murmured, the words escaping before their conscious minds could intercept them. Walker grinned, clearly pleased with himself despite his terrible execution. Did I get it right? Am I saying it correctly? Helena surprised herself by answering, almost. The U sound should be more like this. She demonstrated the proper pronunciation, her voice steady despite her shock at her own boldness. Walker tried again, still wrong, but the effort was unmistakably sincere, and several women smiled despite themselves. Actual smiles. The first ones many of them had worn in months. This became a daily ritual over the following days. Corporal Walker attempting basic German phrases, women correcting his pronunciation with increasing boldness. Walker making the same mistakes repeatedly, but never giving up. Small moments of linguistic connection building a bridge between captors and captives that nobody had planned or authorized. Private Brennan approached Helena during afternoon work detail on that third day. He pulled a photograph from his pocket with the careful reverence of someone handling something precious. A young woman smiled from the creased image, her face bright with youth and possibility. This is my sister, Brennan said, his voice carrying that particular softness people use when speaking of family to strangers. She's about your age, 23, studying to be a teacher back in Ohio. She wants to teach English literature to high school students. Helena pulled her own photograph from her canvas bag, her mother and father standing on either side of her younger brother Klaus, all three smiling at the camera, all three still alive when the photograph was taken. She had no way of knowing whether they remained alive now. My family, she said simply. My parents and my brother Klaus, in Cologne. Brennan studied the photograph with genuine interest. Hope they're all safe, he said quietly. Hope you get home to them soon. Helena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. What she did not know, what she could not know yet, was that her mother and Klaus were already dead, killed in a bombing raid in March, 2 months before her capture, 3 months before this conversation with the young American private who hoped she would be reunited with family who no longer existed. The letter telling her this would arrive in 2 weeks. That letter would break something inside her that had remained intact through years of war and months of captivity. But for now, she still carried hope like a fragile thing that might shatter if examined too closely. June 13th afternoon. Kitchen work detail. Helena was assigned to kitchen duty, part of the rotation of light labor that kept prisoners occupied and useful. The moment she stepped through the kitchen door, she froze. Her Nazi training, her years of propaganda exposure, her entire ideological framework collided with reality in a way that made her question everything she thought she knew about the world. A black man in an army uniform stood at an enormous stove working over massive pots, with the focused attention of a craftsman perfecting his art. He was older than the other soldiers she had seen, perhaps in his early 40s, graying hair visible at his temples, steady hands that moved with the confidence of decades of practice. This was not a draftee serving reluctant time. This was a career soldier, a man who had chosen this life. Sergeant James Washington, though Helena did not know his name yet, did not know his story, knew only that everything she had been taught about race, about hierarchy, about who deserved respect and who deserved contempt, was being challenged simply by watching this man work. Nazi ideology had been explicit and relentless in its racial categorization. The carefully constructed hierarchy that placed Aryans at the top and everyone else arranged below in descending order of supposed worthiness. Black people in this sick framework occupied one of the lowest tiers. Untermenschen, less than human, dangerous, savage, intellectually inferior. Helena had never seen a black person before coming to America. Her exposure to Nazi racial theory had been entirely abstract, divorced from actual human contact. Now, watching Sergeant Washington carefully season soup that would feed her and her fellow prisoners, she felt something fundamental crack inside her chest. He glanced up, saw her watching, did not smile but nodded acknowledgement. "You know how to peel potatoes." Helena nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then grab a knife from the rack over there. We've got 200 people to feed my dinner, and these potatoes won't peel themselves." They worked side by side for 2 hours. Helena peeled potatoes with mechanical efficiency, her hands performing familiar labor, while her mind tried to process what she was experiencing. Washington made soup tasting and adjusting seasoning with the attention of someone who took genuine pride in his craft, not just cooking, creating, caring about the quality of food that would feed people he had no obligation to care about. His movements showed decades of practice, the way he held the spoon, the angle at which he tasted, the almost unconscious adjustment of salt or pepper after each taste. This was not random chance or following instructions. This was skill refined through years of repetition. Washington said little as they worked, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people engaged in necessary labor, finding a rhythm together without needing constant conversation to maintain it. Helena made a cutting error, slicing too deep and losing more potato than necessary. She started to apologize, expecting criticism or mockery. Washington barely glanced over. "Nobody's perfect their first day. You'll get the feel of it. Just keep working." Later, as they continued their tasks, he spoke again. "You know what the secret to good food is?" Helena shook her head. "Respect. You cook with respect for the ingredients, respect for the people who will eat it. Food always turns out right. Respect works like that for most things, actually. You treat something with respect, you get better results than if you treat it with contempt." The words hung in the air between them. Simple, but carrying weight beyond their surface, meaning. Helena did not understand yet what he was trying to tell her. But in 2 days, when he served her and 22 other German women a meal that would change everything, those words about respect would make perfect sense. Because Sergeant Washington was about to demonstrate what dignity looked like when it was real instead of performed, when it was offered to people who had no right to expect it, when it became the most powerful weapon of all. She left the kitchen that evening with her hands smelling of potato starch and her mind churning with questions she did not yet know how to ask. Morning of June 14th, the fourth day of captivity. During roll call, Corporal Walker made an announcement that seemed casual, but would prove to be anything but big meal coming tomorrow afternoon, ladies. Sunday dinner. It's a tradition where we come from. Private Brennan added with obvious enthusiasm, Sergeant Washington has been planning it all week. Says he's cooking like he's back home in Georgia feeding the church congregation after Sunday service. The women exchanged confused glances. Sunday dinner church congregation. The references meant nothing to them. German Sunday meals had become meager affairs by 1943, barely distinguishable from weekday rations. By 1945, the concept of a special meal had disappeared entirely from civilian life. Food was food scarce and precious, measured out in quantities calculated to sustain life without providing any pleasure. The idea that prisoners, enemy prisoners, would receive anything beyond basic sustenance seemed impossible. Beyond impossible. It contradicted everything logical, everything they understood about how conquerors treated the defeated. But throughout that day and into the morning of June 15th, something began to happen that made denial increasingly difficult. Smells started drifting across the compound from the kitchen building. At first faint and unidentifiable. By mid-morning, they were impossible to ignore. Rich, savory, complex. The kind of aromas that made people stop whatever they were doing and turn toward the source drawn by instincts more primitive than thought. By 1100 hours, the smell was unmistakable. Fried chicken, seasoned and perfect. The scent of meat being cooked with care rather than merely rendered edible. Combined with other smells, baking bread, butter, melting herbs, releasing their essence in hot oil. Women on work detail kept pausing, distracted despite themselves. Stomachs clenched with sudden painful hunger that went beyond physical need. This was hunger for something they had forgotten food could be. Not just fuel, but pleasure, comfort. The memory of better times before war consumed everything. Sophie whispered to Helena, "What is that smell?" "It's like before the war. Like when my mother would cook Sunday dinner, and the whole apartment would fill with those smells, and we would know something special was coming." Margaret tried to maintain control, tried to keep the younger women focused. "It's probably for the American staff, officers. Don't get your hopes up. Don't let them see you react." But Helena noticed something that Margaret perhaps did not. Sergeant Washington had been in that kitchen since before dawn. She had seen him enter as she walked to the washroom at 0500, his stride purposeful, his bearing suggesting a man preparing for something important. He was cooking for them. She knew it without being told. Knew it the way you know things that your rational mind has not yet accepted, but your instinct recognizes as truth. At 1330 hours, Margaret gathered the women outside the dining hall. One last attempt to prepare them, to maintain the discipline that had kept them alive through capture and transport in the uncertain early days of captivity. "Remember who we are," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We are prisoners of war. Whatever this is, whatever they have planned, we maintain our dignity. We don't beg, we don't grovel, we don't forget ourselves." But even as she spoke the words, Helena saw Margaret swallow hard, saw her eyes flicker toward the kitchen building, saw the same hunger and confusion rising in their stern leader that was rising in all of them. At 1400 hours exactly, the dining hall doors opened. What waited inside would shatter every belief these 23 women held about their enemies, about America, about kindness and dignity, and what human beings were capable of when they chose mercy over revenge. The moment they stepped through those doors, time seemed to slow. Sounds became muffled, every sense sharpened to almost painful clarity. Long tables had been set with actual ceramic plates, not the tin mess kits they had been using for their previous meals. Real plates, the kind families used for special occasions. The kind that suggested care had been taken with presentation as well as preparation. At the center of each table sat platters piled high with golden fried chicken. The pieces were enormous, glistening with seasoning that caught the afternoon light streaming through windows. The coating was perfectly crispy, that ideal texture that requires both skill and attention to achieve. Each piece looked like something from a memory of abundance, from a time before rationing and scarcity became the defining features of existence. Surrounding the chicken, arranged with obvious care, was a feast that defied comprehension. Mashed potatoes, not the thin, watery mixture they had grown accustomed to, but mountains of them, butter melting into yellow pools on top, steam rising in visible waves. Green beans, Fresh, not canned, cooked with pieces of bacon visible among the green. Someone had taken time to prepare these properly, not just boil them into submission. Corn on the cob, golden ears still steaming butter, waiting nearby in small dishes. Corn, in June, which meant it had been specifically procured, specifically planned for. Warm biscuits piled high in baskets lined with cloth napkins, flaky layers visible where they had split during baking. The kind of biscuits that required skill to make properly, that could not be rushed or approximated. Gravy boats filled to the brim with rich brown gravy, the kind that comes from proper stock and careful reduction. Real butter in small dishes on every table softening in the warm room. Tall glasses of iced tea, the glasses sweating with condensation, lemon slices floating in amber liquid. Several women stopped dead in the doorway. Physical momentum carried them forward, but their minds could not process what they were seeing. The ones behind stumbled into them, causing a confused shuffle of bodies trying to reorganize in the face of something impossible. Sophie made a small sound, half gasp, half sob, a sound that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. Helena felt her knees weaken. She had to steady herself on the doorframe, her hand gripping the wood with enough force that her knuckles went white. Anna's hands began trembling uncontrollably, shaking as if she were standing in freezing cold rather than Texas heat. Margaret, their stern leader, who had warned them against trusting American kindness, actually swayed on her feet. For a moment, Helena thought she might fall. Near the kitchen entrance stood Sergeant James Washington. He wore a clean white apron over his uniform, the fabric spotless and crisp. Tall, dignified, patient. He watched the prisoners' reactions with quiet attention, his expression calm. Not surprised, not smug, just calm, as if he had expected something exactly like this. This was intentional, deliberate. A statement being made through food, through care, through the radical act of treating enemies like human beings worthy of dignity. Captain Sarah Morrison stepped forward. Her voice was gentle, almost careful, as if she understood that her words were landing on people at the absolute edge of their emotional capacity. Please sit down. This is Sunday dinner. In the South, it is a tradition we observe after church services. Sergeant Washington has prepared this meal for everyone at the camp. She paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, that includes you. The women moved to their seats like sleepwalkers. Only years of military training kept them upright and functional. They sat down with mechanical precision, their bodies operating on autopilot while their minds struggled to catch up. Helena found herself directly in front of one of the chicken platters. Steam rose from the mashed potatoes beside it. The smell was overwhelming now. Not just food, but everything. Food could represent care abundance. The possibility that the world was not entirely defined by suffering and scarcity. Corporal Walker spoke, his voice carrying a note of almost pleading encouragement. Go ahead. Don't be shy now. There's plenty more where that came from. Sergeant Washington made sure of that. Sophie was the first to move. Her hands shook as she reached for a piece of chicken. She picked it up with trembling fingers, set it on her plate, stared at it for what felt like an eternity. Then she picked it up with both hands and bit into it. The sound that escaped her mouth was somewhere between a hamp and a sob. Tears sprang immediately to her eyes, spilling over and running down her cheeks. But she did not stop eating. She could not stop eating. Within moments, all 23 women were eating with desperate, shaking hands. This was not about filling empty stomachs. This was about years of deprivation, years of propaganda, years of fear, all colliding with the reality of enemy soldiers who had prepared a feast for them. Around the tables, women wept openly while eating. Some sobbed so hard they could barely chew, but they kept reaching for more food anyway. Margaret, their stoic leader, buried her face in her hands between bites, her shoulders shaking with sobs that came from somewhere beyond rational control. Anna whispered, "Danke, danke, danke," over and over between bites, German spilling out uncontrollably, thanking God and the Americans and the universe for this impossible mercy. Helena bit into the chicken. The taste exploded across her tongue with intensity she had forgotten food could possess. The seasoning was complex, perfectly balanced. Paprika, garlic, black pepper, salt, something sweet she could not identify. The meat was tender and juicy beneath that perfect, crispy coating. The texture was ideal, that combination of crunch and softnesses that required real skill to achieve. It was the best thing she had tasted in 5 years. But the taste was not what broke her. The taste was just food, however extraordinary. What broke her was what the food represented. These were their enemies. The people they had been told would torture them without mercy. People who had every reason to hate Germans, to make them suffer, to give them minimum rations and maximum cruelty. Instead, here was this beautiful, impossible meal, prepared with obvious care by a man their ideology had taught them to despise, offered with dignity by soldiers who could have chosen vengeance and had chosen mercy instead. Tears burned her eyes before she could stop them. They spilled over and ran down her face, and she made no attempt to wipe them away because her hands were occupied with eating and she could not stop, could not slow down, could only keep consuming this evidence that everything she had been taught was a lie. The Americans stood back, clearly unprepared for the intensity of this reaction. Private Brennan looked stricken, as if he had done something terribly wrong. He whispered urgently to Corporal Walker, "Sir, should we do something? Should we help them?" Walker shook his head slowly. "Just let them be, son. They need this. All of it." Captain Morrison's professional mask slipped. Her eyes grew bright with unshed tears. She turned away briefly, composing herself, then turned back to watch with an expression that suggested she was witnessing something she had not fully understood would happen. Sergeant Washington's expression remained mostly unreadable, but his eyes had softened in a way that suggested deep satisfaction. Not pride exactly. Something more fundamental. The satisfaction of someone who has done what he set out to do, who has proven a point that needed proving, who has demonstrated through action rather than words what dignity looks like when it is real. He had understood what this meal would do, had known these women needed to see kindness more than they needed anything else, had known that mercy offered when it is least expected carries more weight than any sermon, any ideology, any carefully constructed argument about the nature of humanity. Camp Hearn was one of over 500 prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States, holding more than 425,000 German prisoners by the war's end. Most Americans did not even know these camps existed, hidden away in rural areas where their presence would not disturb civilian life. But what happened in these camps, particularly in the scorching heat of Texas, would challenge everything both captors and captives believed about each other, would prove that the most powerful weapon in war was not bombs or bullets, but the radical choice to treat enemies like human beings, even when you had every right not to. As the women finally began to slow their eating, as the desperate consumption gave way to something more measured, they sat in stunned silence, staring at picked clean chicken bones, at empty bowls that had held mountains of mashed potatoes, at the evidence of abundance they had been told did not exist. Their stomachs ached from richness and quantity, an unfamiliar discomfort after years of barely adequate rations, the physical sensation of having eaten too much rather than too little. Even that discomfort felt like luxury. Sergeant Washington approached Helena's table while clearing dishes. He moved with quiet dignity, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. "Hope you enjoyed it," he said simply. The question escaped Helena before she could stop it. Why would you do this for us?" Washington considered his response carefully, then spoke words that would echo through the next 20 years of her life. "Sunday dinner ain't about who deserves what. It's about remembering we're all human beings, even when the world tries real hard to convince us otherwise." Helena simply nodded, unable to speak past the emotion closing her throat. She walked back to the barracks in dazed silence with the other women, none of them knowing that this meal was only the beginning. That in 2 weeks the International Red Cross would deliver letters carrying news of destroyed homes and dead families, and horror so vast it would make their personal grief seem almost small by comparison. That discovery would lead them to ask a question that seemed insane. What if they could stay? What if they never went back to Germany at all? The answer would depend on whether Americans truly meant what they preached about second chances and redemption, whether mercy was a one-time gesture or a genuine choice about how to see other human beings, whether a plate of fried chicken offered with dignity could change not just a meal, but an entire life. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the Texas horizon when Helena finally lay in her bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind unable to rest despite her body's exhaustion. Around her, other women whispered quietly in German, processing what had happened, trying to make sense of kindness they had no framework to understand. Tomorrow they would wake to more work, more heat, more waiting. But something fundamental had shifted. Some wall they had built around their hearts to survive had developed cracks. And through those cracks was seeping a possibility more terrifying than any punishment, the possibility that they had been wrong about everything. The days following that Sunday meal felt suspended in a strange twilight between captivity and something else entirely. Something none of the women had words for because their language had been built on assumptions that were crumbling faster than they could rebuild them. Monday morning arrived with the same brutal Texas heat, the same roll call routine, the same work assignments. But everything felt different now. The women moved through their tasks with an awareness that had not existed before, watching their captors, with new eyes searching for patterns that might explain the contradiction between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing. Helena found herself assigned to kitchen duty again. When she entered that morning, Sergeant Washington was already at work preparing what would become breakfast for 200 people. He glanced up, nodded acknowledgement, and gestured toward a pile of potatoes that needed peeling. They worked in comfortable silence for perhaps 30 minutes before Washington spoke. "My mama taught me to cook," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the kitchen's early morning stillness. "She used to say that feeding people right was a form of respect, that how you treat food tells people how you see them." Helena's hands continued their work peeling potatoes with growing efficiency, but her attention was entirely on his words. She was born into slavery in 1859. Washington continued, his tone matter-of-fact, as if discussing something historical rather than personal. "Got freed after the Civil War, but freedom didn't mean much when you had no land, no money, no education. She worked as a cook for a white family in Georgia. Made the best Sunday dinners in 3 counties, though she rarely got to sit at the table and eat what she made." He paused to check the temperature of oil heating on the stove, adjusting the flame with practiced precision. "My father grew up under Jim Crow. Couldn't vote. Couldn't use the same water fountains as white folks. Couldn't look white men in the eye without risking violence. He joined the army in the Great War, thought serving his country would earn him the respect he deserved. Came home and still couldn't drink from the same fountain as the men he'd fought alongside." Helena stopped peeling, turned to look at him directly. "Why are you telling me this?" Washington met her eyes. "Because you asked yesterday why I do something kind for people who used to be enemies. Figure you deserve an honest answer. My people were brought to this country against their will, enslaved, brutalized, told for generations we didn't belong, weren't good enough, weren't fully human. But our children and grandchildren built lives here anyway. Not because we were welcomed, but because we chose to belong. We made this place home through sheer determination to be treated like the human beings we always were." He returned to his work, cracking eggs into an enormous bowl with smooth efficiency. "I learned something watching my mama and my father," he said. "Learned that hate makes you smaller, makes your world smaller, makes everything you touch smaller. But treating people with dignity, even when they don't deserve it, even when they've been taught to despise you, that makes the world bigger. Opens up possibilities that didn't exist before." The words settled over Helena like weight and promise simultaneously. She did not fully understand yet what he was trying to tell her, but she recognized the gift of being spoken to as an equal, as someone worthy of truth rather than propaganda. Tuesday morning brought something that would become one of the most powerful symbols these women would carry forward into their American lives. Sergeant Washington prepared a special breakfast. The smell began drifting across the compound before dawn, reaching into the barracks and pulling women from sleep with its intensity. Bacon. Not the thin, precious strips they remembered from Germany before rationing destroyed such luxuries. American bacon. Thick cut, sizzling in cast-iron skillets that had been seasoning for decades. The sound was distinct and unmistakable, fat popping and crackling, edges curling as they crisped. The aroma was overwhelming, filling not just the kitchen, but the entire compound. Rich, smoky, salty, everything that made life worth living distilled into one perfect smell. When the women entered the dining hall for breakfast, they found platters piled with bacon alongside scrambled eggs cooked in the rendered fat toast made from fresh bread and coffee that was strong and abundant. Anna bit into her first strip of American bacon. Her eyes widened. She made an involuntary sound of pleasure that was almost embarrassing in its intensity. "I don't have words," she whispered to Helena. I literally cannot describe this. Clara looked around the table in disbelief. Americans eat this for breakfast every morning. Corporal Walker overheard, nodded casually. Most mornings, yeah. Bacon and eggs, coffee, toast. Pretty standard American breakfast. Nothing special about it. But it was special, devastatingly special, because it revealed something the women had not fully grasped until this moment. The abundance gap between their country and America was not just about military might or industrial capacity. It was about a fundamental difference in how societies functioned, how resources were distributed, how ordinary people lived their daily lives. While Germany had been starving, Americans had been eating bacon for breakfast. Not officers, not the wealthy elite. Everyone. This was normal, standard, the baseline of American life. Helena's mind struggled with the implications. Had the war been partly about this, about a desperate resource-starved nation trying to take by force what wealthier nations possess through better systems, better geography, better fortune? The question was uncomfortable because it suggested German suffering had been self-inflicted through catastrophically bad leadership rather than imposed by cruel enemies. Wednesday afternoon brought another revelation. The temperature had climbed to 108 degrees. Private Brennan appeared at the worksite carrying a crate filled with glass bottles, beaded with condensation. Ice cold despite the brutal heat. Dark liquid visible through the green glass. Coca-Cola, he announced. Figured you ladies might appreciate something cold. The women had never seen Coca-Cola before, had heard of it vaguely as an American product, but had no context for what it was or why it mattered. Sophie took the first bottle, pressed the cold glass against her forehead for a moment, savoring the shock of coolness, then lifted it to her lips and took a careful sip. Her eyes went wide. She gasped, laughed, gasped again as the carbonation tickled her nose. The taste was unlike anything she had experienced. Sweet but complex, vanilla and caramel and citrus and spices she could not name. The bubbles created a sensation that was almost painful, but in the most delightful way possible. The reaction spread through the group like joy given physical form. Women passing bottles, everyone trying, everyone surprised and delighted by this strange, wonderful beverage. Margaret took a long drink, then looked at the bottle in her hand as if it held answers to questions she had not known how to ask. "What is this?" Brennan grinned. "Coca-Cola. Best thing to come out of Atlanta, Georgia. You can get it anywhere in America. Gas stations, restaurants, corner stores, everywhere." Helena held her bottle and thought about what it represented. This small thing, this casual luxury that Americans could give away to prisoners on a hot afternoon without thinking twice. The industrial capacity to mass produce it. The distribution network to make it available everywhere. The wealth that made wasting ice on cold soda seem normal rather than extravagant. Even their drinks had been about scarcity in Germany. Watered down, rationed, precious. But Americans could afford to make soda cold and give it away freely to enemy prisoners just because it was a hot day, and kindness cost them nothing. Thursday evening brought baseball. Guards organized a game during their off-duty hours and invited the prisoners to watch. The women sat in the grass beyond the makeshift field, confused by the rules but fascinated by the Americans' infectious enthusiasm. Corporal Walker tried to explain. "See, you hit the ball with the bat, then run to first base, then if you're safe you try for second, and the other team tries to get you out by catching the ball or tagging you before you reach the base." He paused, laughed at himself. "You know what, it's probably easier to just watch and let it make sense as you go." Someone brought a portable radio to the field. The voice of a sports announcer crackled through static, calling a Yankees versus Red Sox game happening hundreds of miles away. The Americans went quiet, listening with an intensity that suggested this mattered deeply to them. "And here's DiMaggio stepping up to the plate," the announcer's voice carried across the field. "Two men on bottom of the ninth, Yankees down by one." The Americans leaned forward, collectively holding their breath. When DiMaggio connected with the ball, when the announcer's voice rose to a shout describing the hit, half the Americans cheered while the other half groaned. Friendly arguments broke out immediately about whether DiMaggio was the best player in baseball or merely one of the best. Helena watched this ritual with something approaching wonder. They gathered around that radio like Germans had gathered around radios to hear Hitler's speeches. But there was joy in this. Genuine pleasure. Friendly disagreement without fear. Shared passion for something that brought people together rather than dividing them into acceptable and unacceptable categories. Sophie asked Private Brennan during a break in the game, "Is baseball always this important to Americans?" Brennan's face lit up. "Ma'am, baseball is America. It's democracy in action. Everybody gets their turn at bat no matter who they are. Three strikes and you're out applies to everyone equally. Best team wins based on skill, not on who their parents were or what class they belong to. It's the fairest game ever invented." The simplicity of that statement carried weight beyond its surface meaning. A game where everyone played by the same rules, where merit determined outcomes, where yesterday's failure did not prevent tomorrow's success. These small moments accumulated like evidence in a trial. Bacon, Coca-Cola, baseball, each one a piece of American culture offered freely to people who had been enemies days earlier. Each one suggesting that the propaganda about American brutality and selfishness had been projection rather than observation. But these moments of cultural exchange and growing trust were about to collide with devastating news from across the Atlantic. Letters were coming. Letters that would force these women to confront not just the loss of their families, but the revelation of what their country had truly been doing while they served it. The International Red Cross had been working frantically to establish communication channels between displaced persons and their families. The process was chaotic. Much of Germany lay in ruins. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble by bombing campaigns that had intensified during the war's final year. Millions of people were scattered across Europe with no clear records of who had survived and who had died. On June 28, 1945, 16 days after their arrival at Camp Hearn, Captain Morrison made an announcement during morning roll call. "Letters from Germany have arrived through the International Red Cross. This is the first communication most of you will have had with home since your capture." The words hit like physical blows. Letters. From home. After months of silence and uncertainty and desperate hope. The women stood rigid in formation, but Helena could see the trembling beginning in several of them. The barely controlled emotion threatening to break through years of military discipline. Morrison began calling names. Some women stepped forward to receive thin envelopes. Others waited their names never called, facing the special torture of continued uncertainty. Helena heard her name, walked forward on legs that felt disconnected from her body, accepted the envelope with hands that shook despite her attempts at control. The handwriting on the front was not her mother's familiar, elegant script. It belonged to Frau Kemper, a neighbor who had lived 3 doors down from Helena's family in Cologne. She walked to her bunk, sat down carefully, opened the envelope with movements that felt rehearsed and mechanical because if she allowed herself to feel anything yet, she would shatter completely. The letter was brief, direct, devastating in its simplicity. Her family's apartment building had been destroyed in a bombing raid on March 3, 1945. 6 weeks before the war ended, 6 weeks before surrender made all the death pointless. Her mother and younger brother Klaus had been killed. The raid happened at night while people slept. Officials said the deaths were quick, though Helena suspected that detail was offered more for the living's comfort than from any actual knowledge of how her family died. Her father had survived the initial bombing, but disappeared during the chaotic final days of April. Some neighbors said he went searching for Klaus in the rubble and never returned. Others said he simply could not bear what he found and walked away from everything. No one had seen him since. The neighborhood she remembered was gone. Most of Cologne was gone. Those who survived were living in makeshift shelters among the ruins, searching for food, trying to make sense of what remained. Helena read the letter 3 times. The words did not penetrate at first. They seemed like symbols without meaning, like a language she had once known but could no longer translate. Then reality crashed over her like a wave of ice water. Mama, Klaus, Papa, all gone. Everything she had endured, all the fear and hardship and desperate hope of eventual reunion, had been for nothing. There was no home to return to, no family waiting, only absence and ash, and the bitter arithmetic of war that cared nothing for individual suffering. She did not cry, could not cry. The grief was too massive to fit inside her body. It sat on her chest like a physical weight, making each breath an effort of will. Around the barracks, similar scenes were unfolding. Women reading letters, faces going pale. The careful collapse into bunks as legs refused to support weight anymore. The spreading silence of collective grief as each woman learned her private variation of loss. That evening, Sergeant Washington appeared in the barracks doorway. He did not speak at first, just stood there, his presence offering something that had nothing to do with words. Finally, he spoke to the room. Lost my younger brother in the Great War. Influenza got him in France in 1918. Got the telegram while I was still stationed overseas. Couldn't go home for the funeral. Had to keep cooking, keep working, keep going, while my mama buried her baby boy alone. He paused, letting that truth settle. Grief is grief. Doesn't matter what flag you served under or what uniform you wore. You've got a right to feel it, all of it. The anger, the sadness, the confusion about who to blame and who to hate. Another pause. Kitchen's open if anybody needs to work through it. Sometimes keeping your hands busy helps when your heart's too full to think straight. Helena took him up on the offer. Spent 3 hours that night helping prepare breakfast for the next morning. Peeled potatoes while tears ran down her face unchecked. Washington worked beside her in understanding silence, not trying to fix what could not be fixed, just bearing witness to grief that had no outlet except continued existence. But personal grief was about to be dwarfed by collective horror. Because the next morning, Helena would pick up an American newspaper left in the common area. She would see photographs from liberated concentration camps, and she would be forced to confront a question more terrible than any personal loss. What if the country she had served had committed evil beyond comprehension? June 30th, 1945. 2 days after the letters arrived, the common area where American newspapers were left for anyone to read. Helena entered during lunch break, still moving through her days with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose emotions had been temporarily shut down by overload. Grief was a luxury she could not yet afford to fully feel. She had to keep functioning, keep working, keep existing until her mind could catch up with what her heart already knew. She picked up a copy of Stars and Stripes dated June 15th. The front page hit her like a fist to the stomach. Horror beyond words. Liberation of Nazi death camps. The headline stretched across the entire width of the page. Below it, photographs that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Images so terrible that her mind tried to reject them as propaganda, as exaggeration, as anything except truth. Emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood. Mass graves containing thousands of corpses. Survivors who looked barely human, their bodies reduced to skeletal frames draped in skin, their eyes hollow with trauma beyond description. Children among the dead. Mountains of shoes. Piles of eyeglasses. Human hair collected in enormous quantities for purposes she could not bear to contemplate. Horror that was industrial in scale. Systematic. Bureaucratic. Efficient. The application of German organizational skills to the project of mass murder. Helena's hands began to shake. The newspaper rustled audibly as tremors spread through her body. She could not look away, could not stop reading, could not unsee what was now burned into her consciousness forever. The articles detailed numbers that defied comprehension. Over 6 million Jews systematically murdered, millions of others, political prisoners, disabled people, Roma, homosexuals, anyone the regime deemed unworthy of life. Camps specifically designed for killing, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoriums running continuously, entire families erased from existence with bureaucratic precision. This was not war. War killed soldiers in combat, destroyed cities, caused civilian casualties as terrible side effects of military objectives. This was something else entirely, something for which the existing vocabulary was inadequate. Genocide. The deliberate attempt to erase entire categories of human beings from the earth. An American soldier's testimony from Bergen-Belsen liberation filled half a column. His words were stark, stripped of embellishment, carrying the weight of witnessed truth. The smell hit us a mile before we reached the camp. Death has a smell you never forget. There were bodies everywhere, in piles, in pits, lying where they had fallen. Some prisoners were still alive, but so emaciated you could not tell them apart from the corpses at first glance. A woman grabbed my hand. I could see every bone in her fingers. She weighed maybe 70 pounds. She said in broken English, "Thank you for coming. We thought the whole world had forgotten us. I am a soldier. I fought at Normandy. I have seen men die in combat, but nothing prepared me for this. This was not war. This was something evil we do not have words for. Helena felt something fundamental breaking inside her chest. Not the clean break of a bone that could be set and healed, but the splintering of something structural, something that held her sense of self together. She had not operated a gas chamber, had not shot anyone, had never even seen one of these camps. But she had transmitted radio messages for this government, had worn this uniform with something approaching pride, had believed or at least had not questioned her country's cause. And this is what her country had been doing while she served it. Memory flooded back with sickening clarity. The Goldstein family who had lived 3 doors down from her family in Cologne. Mr. Goldstein who ran a small jewelry shop. Mrs. Goldstein who always had sweets for neighborhood children. Their daughter Sarah, who was Helena's age, who had dreamed of becoming a violinist. One day they were there, the next gone. Their apartment emptied overnight, windows dark. 10-year-old Helena had asked her father where they went. Resettlement in the East for the war effort. Don't worry about it. And she had not worried about it, had not asked follow-up questions, had accepted the explanation and moved on with her life because it was easier than confronting uncomfortable possibilities. Chosen ignorance, deliberate blindness, the willing refusal to see what was happening right in front of her because seeing would have required action and action would have meant danger. Sophie sat down beside Helena, picked up another newspaper. The New York Times, different photographs but the same impossible truth. She made a sound like someone had punched her. Did you know, Sophie whispered in German, did any of us know this was happening? Other women began gathering. Clara found a copy of the Chicago Tribune. Margaret picked up the Washington Post. All of them carried the same stories. All of them with photographs that proved beyond any doubt this was not Allied propaganda or enemy exaggeration. This was real. This happened. Their country did this. Margaret's face had gone pale as old paper. Her hands shook as she held the newspaper. I heard rumors, she said, her voice barely audible. Near the end of the war, there were whispers about camps, about Jews being sent east, about people not coming back. But I thought I told myself it was wartime propaganda. Enemy exaggeration meant to make us look evil. I am a nurse. I swore an oath to help people to heal. And I worked for a government that systematically murdered millions while I tended wounded soldiers. How do I reconcile that? Anna's voice was hollow, emptied of everything except dawning horror. We wore the uniform. We served the same regime that built these camps, that ran these gas chambers. How can we claim innocence when we were part of the machine? Even if we did not know, should we have known? Should we have asked more questions? Should we have resisted somehow? Martha, whose letter had revealed her SS officer husband was being tried for war crimes, stared at photographs of Dachau liberation. The letter had said he served there, had said he did terrible things. She had wanted to believe it was a mistake, a case of mistaken identity, anything except the truth now staring at her from these newspaper pages. What if it is true, she whispered. What if he participated in this? What if I married a man who did these things? She could not finish the sentence. Started crying. The first real emotion she had shown since learning her husband's fate. Not crying for him, crying for the version of reality that had just been destroyed, for the comfortable lies she had been living in. Clara, who had received no letter at all, whose family's fate remained unknown, spoke with terrible clarity. Maybe this is why no one wrote to me. Maybe my whole family was involved. Maybe they are dead. Maybe they are on trial. I do not know which would be worse. The sound of boots on wooden floor made them all look up. Corporal Walker stood in the doorway. He had clearly come looking for them and had clearly seen what they were reading. He stood there in silence for a long moment, then spoke with careful deliberation, choosing each word with obvious thought. Those camps, what happened in there? That is something your country has to reckon with for a long time, maybe forever. And I will not pretend to know what you all knew or did not know, what you could have done differently. I was not there. I do not know what it was like to live under that government, to grow up with that propaganda, to be taught from childhood that some people were more human than others. He paused, looked at each woman directly. But I do know this. Sitting here right now, looking at those pictures with horror on your faces, that tells me something important. You are not monsters. You are people learning terrible truths about what was done in your name. What you do with that knowledge, that is up to you now. But at least you are not turning away from it. At least you are willing to see it and sit with how terrible it is. Helena met his eyes, found her voice, though it came out raw and broken. How can you be kind to us after knowing what our country did, after seeing those photographs? Walker's response was quiet but carried absolute conviction. Because hating you does not undo what happened. And you are not the people who built those camps or operated those gas chambers. You are just people trying to figure out what comes next. Same as all of us trying to figure out how to live in a world where something like that was even possible. His words planted something in Helena's mind, a seed that would take weeks to germinate but would eventually grow into a decision that would change her entire life. If she was not defined by her country's worst crimes, could she choose to become someone different? And if she could, where would that choice lead her? That night in the barracks, after lights out, the women could not sleep. Whispered conversations in German filled the darkness with questions that had no easy answers. Sophie's voice came from somewhere to Helena's left. How do we go back? My parents survived, but they are living in ruins, surrounded by this guilt, surrounded by the knowledge of what our country did. How do I return to that? Margaret responded from her bunk near the door. I swore an oath as a nurse to save lives, to heal, to help. But I worked for a government that murdered millions while I was bandaging soldiers. How do I live with that? How do I reconcile those two truths? Anna spoke from across the room. My children need me. They are being raised by my sister in a country that will be defined by this horror for generations. What do I tell them when they are older? How do I explain that their mother wore this uniform? Martha's voice came unexpected, surprising everyone. She had been so quiet since learning about her husband. What if we asked to stay here in America? Shocked silence filled the barracks. The idea was so radical, so unprecedented, that no one knew how to respond at first. I have no family in Germany, Martha continued. My husband was part of this horror. But here, I have been treated like a human being despite everything. What if there is a way to stay? To build something different? Margaret's response was immediate and sharp. That is desertion. We cannot abandon our country when it needs rebuilding. That is cowardice. But Helena found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to. Is it cowardice, or is it choosing a different way to atone? If I go back to Germany, I return to ruins, to guilt, to a country that will spend generations trying to reckon with what it did. If I stay here, if they would even let me, maybe I could become someone better, someone who helps instead of harms, someone who proves that individuals can be more than the worst things their country did. The conversation continued in whispers until exhaustion finally claimed them one by one. But the seed had been planted. The impossible idea had been spoken aloud. And over the next 2 weeks, it would grow from fantasy into desperate hope, into a request so unprecedented it would test whether America truly meant what it claimed about second chances and redemption. July 10th, 1945. Kitchen duty again. Helena and Sergeant Washington working side by side in the early morning quiet before the compound fully woke. They had fallen into comfortable routine over the past weeks, working mostly in silence, the quiet broken occasionally by practical questions or brief observations. But today, Helena could not maintain the silence. The question that had been building inside her for 10 days finally forced its way out. I have nowhere to go. Washington did not stop working. His hands continued their steady rhythm, cracking eggs into an enormous bowl. Most folks do not these days. No, Helena's voice cracked. You do not understand. My family is dead. My city is destroyed. And even if it was not, how can I go back to a country that built death camps, that murdered millions? But I do not belong here either. I am a prisoner, an enemy. My country did those terrible things. What right do I have to want to stay in America? Washington stopped working now, set down the bowl, turned to face her directly. What he said next would become the foundation on which Helena would build her entire American life. You want to know what right you have? I will tell you a story. My grandmother was born on a plantation in Georgia in 1859. She was property, not a person. owned by another human being the way you would own a horse. She was freed after the Civil War, but freedom did not mean much when you had no land, no money, no education, and a whole society still treating you like you were not fully human. She worked as a cook for a white family, made the best Sunday dinners in 3 counties, never got to sit at the table with the people she fed. He paused, checking that Helena was truly listening. My father grew up under Jim Crow, could not vote, could not use the same facilities as white folks, could not look white men in the eye without risking violence. He joined the army in the Great War, thought serving his country would earn him the respect he deserved. Came home and still could not drink from the same water fountain as the men he had fought alongside. My people were brought to this country against their will, enslaved, brutalized, told for generations we did not belong, we're not good enough, we're not fully human. But our children and grandchildren built lives here anyway. Not because we were welcome, not because we were invited, but because we chose to belong. We made this place home through sheer stubborn determination to be treated as the human beings we always were. Washington's expression was serious, but not unkind. Now, I am not saying your situation is exactly the same as mine. It is not. You wore a uniform for a country that did evil things. That is something you will carry for the rest of your life. That is a weight you will never fully put down. But I am saying this, belonging is not always about where you were born or what your people did. Sometimes home is something you choose rather than something you are given. Sometimes you have to decide who you want to become instead of who you were. Cannot change what happened. Cannot change what your country did. But you can choose what you do next. Helena's tears were falling freely now. How do I choose to become someone better when I do not deserve the chance? Washington's answer unlocked everything. Maybe that is exactly why you should take it, because you know you do not deserve it. Folks who think they deserve everything, they do not usually do much good with what they are given. They take it for granted. But folks who know they have been given a gift they do not deserve, those folks tend to work real hard to earn it, tend to spend their whole lives trying to prove themselves worthy of a second chance they never should have gotten. That kind of gratitude, that kind of determination that changes people, changes communities, sometimes changes the world. He went back to his eggs. The conversation was over. But everything had changed. Helena stood there with a potato peeler in her hand and tears drying on her face. And she made a decision that would alter the entire trajectory of her life. She would ask to stay. Even if they said no, even if it was impossible, she would ask. 5 days later, Captain Morrison made an announcement that forced the decision from abstract possibility into concrete reality. July 15th, morning assembly. Morrison stood before them with official documents. I have received orders from the War Department regarding your repatriation to Germany. Processing will begin within 2 weeks. You will be transported to New York then, to ships bound for Europe. From there, you will be processed through displaced persons camps in Germany before being released. Some women looked relieved, finally going home. Others looked stricken, returning to ruins and guilt and a future defined by horror. Helena felt strange numbness spreading through her chest. Return to what, turn to whom? That night, 12 women gathered in quiet conversation. By the end, 10 had committed to trying the impossible. They would ask to stay. 3 days later, on July 18th, those 10 women approached Captain Morrison together. Helena served as spokesperson. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to speak clearly. Captain Morrison, we would like to formally request permission to remain in the United States rather than return to Germany. We understand this is unprecedented. We understand we are prisoners of war and that Geneva Convention requires our repatriation. But we are asking you to help us find another way, to reclassify us as displaced persons, as refugees, as immigrants seeking asylum. We have lost our families, our homes. We have learned truths about our country that make return impossible, not physically but morally. Here we have been treated with humanity and dignity despite everything our country did. We want the opportunity to earn that humanity, to spend the rest of our lives proving ourselves worthy of it. We want the chance to become Americans, not because we deserve it, but because we believe we can become worthy of it through hard work, through service, through choosing to be better than we were. Morrison sat down slowly, clearly struggling to process this unprecedented request. I do not even know if what you are asking is legally possible. You are enemy prisoners of war. International law requires your repatriation. I do not have authority to just keep you here, but I will contact Washington. I will explain your situation, but I make absolutely no promises. This may be impossible. The wait was agonizing, 2 weeks of limbo, not knowing if they would be forced back or given an impossible second chance. The answer came on July 23rd. Morrison called the 10 women to her office. The War Department will not prevent repatriation of any prisoner who wishes to return immediately. However, given the exceptional circumstances, documented family losses, destroyed homes consistently, good behavior, those who wish to remain may be reclassified as displaced persons eligible for immigration under existing refugee provisions. Sophie gasped. We can stay. Morrison's caution was immediate. It is not that simple. This is not approval. This is permission to try. You will need American sponsors willing to vouch for you personally. You will need guaranteed employment and housing. You will need communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. The process could take months. There is no guarantee any of you will succeed, and you will face suspicion, hostility. People who lost sons and brothers fighting Germans are not going to forgive easily. You will need to prove yourselves every single day for the rest of your lives. But it was possible. That was enough. Over the next 4 months, sponsors emerged. Corporal Walker's sister Ruth, who owned a boarding house in Bryan, offered to sponsor Sophie. The local Baptist congregation voted to sponsor 3 women collectively. A wealthy widow whose son died at Normandy wrote saying her son would have wanted mercy. A Jewish businessman controversially sponsored one woman saying if he could not forgive, what was all the fighting for? By early 1946, all 10 women had immigration approvals. The real work of earning their place was just beginning. June 12, 1965, 20 years to the day since their arrival at Camp Hearn, Helena stood in her Houston kitchen, 44 years old, teaching her 11-year-old daughter Margaret to make fried chicken using Sergeant Washington's recipe. Her son Thomas, 9 years old, watched from the table. Mom, why do we always make fried chicken on this day? Thomas asked. Helena smiled through sudden tears. Because 20 years ago, this meal saved my life. Not from starvation, from something worse. From believing that people who were different from me were my enemies forever. A man named Sergeant Washington made this meal for me when I had no reason to expect kindness and every reason to expect punishment. He taught me that feeding people with respect can change the world. That treating people with dignity, even when they do not deserve it, can transform them into something better. So we make this meal every year to remember. We are who we are because someone chose mercy over hatred. Someone chose to see possibility instead of just past. And now it is your job to pass that lesson forward. That afternoon, the annual reunion filled her home. Sophie, now married with 3 children. Margaret, head nurse at Memorial Hospital. The other women who had chosen to stay. Corporal Walker, now a high school principal. Private Brennan, successful businessman. Captain Morrison, devoted to refugee work and retirement. And Sergeant Washington, 64 years old, sitting at the head of the table with quiet dignity. Before the meal, Helena stood as she did every year. 20 years ago today, Sergeant Washington served us fried chicken. Some of us cried because we could not reconcile the kindness with what we had been taught to believe. That meal changed everything. Not because of the food, but because of what it represented. Someone saw past the uniform, past the war, past everything our country did, and chose to offer dignity instead of revenge. Washington smiled slightly. Just did what my mama taught me. Feed folks with respect. Sometimes that changes things. But then he continued, and what he said surprised them all. But I want to tell you something I never told any of you before. That Sunday dinner 20 years ago, it was not just my idea. Captain Morrison came to me 3 days after you arrived. She said, Washington, these women have been through hell. They have been lied to about us. I want you to cook them the best meal you have ever made. Show them what America really is. All eyes turned to Morrison. She looked surprised, almost embarrassed. I asked him to cook a good meal, she said quietly. What he gave you was dignity. That was all him. Washington shook his head. You had the vision. I just made it real. That is how change happens. Someone has to have the courage to imagine mercy. Then someone else has to have the skill to deliver it. The table was laden with fried chicken made from his recipe with American dishes and German dishes side by side. Outside, second-generation children played together. American kids with German last names growing up without memory of war, just family and friends. That evening, as guests departed, Morrison pulled Helena aside privately. "I never told you this," Morrison said, "but you and the other 9 women did not just build American lives. You proved my decision was right. You proved that mercy is not weakness. In my 30 years of refugee work since then, I have sponsored 87 more people from 23 different countries. Every single one because of what you 10 showed me was possible." Helena embraced her former captor, now friend. "Thank you for seeing us as worth saving." "Thank you," Morrison replied, her voice thick, "for proving we were right to treat him." Later, Helena and Washington sat on the porch watching children play. "I never properly thanked you," Helena said quietly. "You have thanked me every year for 20 years. Not for the chicken, for seeing me, for seeing who I could become instead of only who I had been." Washington's response was simple. "You did the becoming. I just held up a mirror and showed you it was possible." They sat in comfortable silence. Proof that enemies could become a family. That mercy could ripple forward across generations. That a single plate of fried chicken offered with dignity could change not just a meal, but an entire life. The paradox of Camp Hearn was simple and profound. In showing kindness to those who had no right to expect it, America won a victory more complete than any battlefield triumph. 23 German women arrived at Camp Hearn expecting torture. They received fried chicken instead. 10 chose to stay. They raised 26 American children. Through Helena's work at the State Department Displaced Persons Office, they helped process over 12,000 refugees. Through Margaret's mentorship at Memorial Hospital, they trained hundreds of nurses. Through Martha's seamstress business, they employed dozens of displaced persons. They paid forward the mercy they received, multiplied by decades of gratitude. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of that Sunday meal, the city of Bryan, Texas, erected a small bronze plaque at the site where Camp Hearn once stood. It reads, "Here in June 1945, Sergeant James Washington served Sunday dinner to 23 enemy soldiers. 10 chose to stay. They proved that the most powerful weapon is not bombs or bullets, but simple human decency offered when it would be easier to withhold." Sergeant Washington died in 1978 at age 75, surrounded by the families of the women he had fed with respect 33 years earlier. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, including 3 former German prisoners of war who had become American citizens, American mothers, American grandmothers. His tombstone, paid for by those women, carries the words he lived by: "Feed folks with respect. Sometimes that changes everything." Helena Brandt Chen lived until 1998. She spent her final years teaching refugee families to make fried chicken using Washington's recipe, passing forward the lesson one meal at a time. In the end, Sergeant Washington's mama had been right all along. Feed folks with respect, and sometimes, just sometimes, that changes everything. Not just the people you feed, but the world they build afterward and the generations that follow.